In this video, we're going to do a quick critique of the classical elements project. When doing a critique of an illustration, I like to look at it in terms of these two categories, the concept of the illustration and the technique used to execute it. Let's talk about these two ideas independently. The first question I ask when considering concept is the concept discernible? By that I mean, is the idea behind the illustration something that someone could figure out without having to have it explained to them? The next thing I ask is the concept interesting? Now that's a tough question because interesting is different for almost everybody. Most people find the classical narrative elements of setting, character, and situation interesting. But anything dramatic is interesting, including high contrasts. Connected to this idea, though, is the concept novel? Meaning, is this idea new, or is it something that we've seen before? Now, not every concept needs to be novel, although we do, as artists, have a need to say something unique and personal. And as viewers, we are always drawn to the new. Let's talk quickly about technique. When I talk about technique, I'm just talking about the principles and methods used to execute the illustration. The first thing I like to think about is the composition. I like to ask myself this question: how is the composition handled? Is there, for example, a clear focal point? Do the supporting elements of the composition support the focal point? In other words, does the composition form a unity? The next thing I like to ask, especially for this project, is how is the line handled? Is there a variety of line weight? Is there a variety of line style? Is the line interesting? Is the line consistent? Is the line weight appropriate for the subject and the composition? Next, I like to ask, how is the value handled? Do we have a full tonal range, or is it a limited tonal range? Perhaps there's no tone at all. And how is the color handled? Is there a full spectrum from warm to cool, or is it a limited palette? Perhaps it's black and white. This is something that's very important when we're talking about illustration. How are the edges handled? Were the edges emphasized and hard-edged, or were they softened and de-emphasized? Or perhaps there's a combination of what we call lost and found edges. How is the light handled? Is there a diffuse lighting, or is there a clear light source? Are there deep shadows, or perhaps there's no shading at all? Finally, how is perspective handled? Is there a consistent perspective with an identifiable vanishing point? Or is it an inconsistent perspective that maybe is more inspired by cubist layouts? Is there a clear foreground, midground, and background, or is it just all flat? Now, I won't ask each one of these questions from each one of these illustrations. Each one of these illustrations will emphasize one of these properties and techniques a little bit more than another one. With that said, let's take a look at these illustrations. So here we are on the idea refinery, and if I scroll down, you can see that I have the classical elements illustrations that I have received so far, all posted here on the idea refinery. If you would like to follow along with this critique, you can open up this post and just click on each image as we go. I have them mostly in order, but I have them all open in tabs across the top here, and I'm just going to click here. We're going to start with you, Alyssa. Now, conceptually, what Alyssa has created here are the classical elements as interpreted as natural disasters. The concept is really quite interesting. I particularly like the boulders falling across the road to suggest Earth. My only issue is that two of the illustrations feature roads moving off into the distance that have been threatened or blocked by the elements, whereas the two at the bottom are consistent in how they are showing houses being threatened by the elements. That's an interesting dichotomy, and I'm not sure if that's something you intended, but it does feel a little bit like an inconsistent concept. Now, technique-wise, each one of these displays some wonderful technique. I love the line work and cross-hatching in the boulder illustration and how you've handled the black and white balance of the water one. However, the fire one has been handled in a different way. You'll notice that Alyssa has used an ink wash to suggest the fire and flames. In terms of technique, again, we see a little bit of an inconsistency. However, each one of them is absolutely fabulous. I love these, Alyssa. Way to go. Emily has done something here very interesting. Just in time for Halloween, we see the four elements as interpreted by the classic ghost with the sheet over its head. Emily has been very restrained in how she's introduced the elements into this ghost. I love the drip at the bottom of the water ghost, or the subtle flow of the bottom of the sheet for the wind. Technique-wise, this is really interesting. Emily is using stipple, which is just dots placed closer or further apart to suggest the different values. What's really impressive is that not only has Emily made the stippling consistent within the illustrations, but there is a consistency that has been maintained throughout all four. That's a real challenge. Way to go, Emily. Now, Avery, this is really interesting. Avery's concept, the four elements as experienced by cats. These are really charming. I think you've captured something of the nature of cats. What I love about the composition of these pieces is how Avery has used the solid black shape to help frame her foreground cats. This has allowed her to do limited tonal range in her shading while still maintaining dramatic focal points. If I was to make a change here, though, Avery, I would take the background of the fire one and make it completely black, the way you have with the cat in the tree for Earth. I think that would make this look a little bit more consistent. Way to go. Now, Brenna has done something really interesting here. She's taken some animals associated with the West Coast and interpreted them in a sort of fantastical, mythological way. I love how the wolf emerges from the flames of a forest fire, or the constellation patterns in the owl. Technique-wise, these are absolutely astounding. Brenna has been remarkably consistent with her tonal range and line quality throughout. And notice all the little shots of white detail that emerge from those big black shapes in the background. These are stunning, Brenna. Way to go. Now, Claire has done something really interesting with the elements, interpreting them as Asian-inspired tattoos, which is a very interesting and unique concept. My only issues with this, Claire, are some technique issues. Primarily, it's around the line and the weight of the line that you've used. It is verging on too thin. If you did want to revisit this, you could go back over a couple of your lines with your pen and pull out some of the contour lines, the lines that go around your subject a little bit more. And I think you would find that that line weight variability will create some more dynamics within the compositions. Very nicely done, Claire. Now, Danny, you've done something very interesting with concept, the four elements as interpreted by camping out in the mountains. But I think it's your technique that is the most interesting part of this set. You'll notice how consistent Danny has been with the line work. Each of the four pieces has variable line weights. Danny's been very careful to keep the contours of the shapes heavy, while some of the interior lines that describe some of the interior shapes and cross contours are handled very lightly. The hatching has been handled in a very limited way, but look at the consistency with the angle. That consistency of angle is really important for unifying the pieces together. I particularly love the cloud pattern in the top left. Absolutely stunning. Now let's take a look at Eugenia's interpretation of the four elements. Now I'm sure there's a greater story behind some of these here, but I see these as sort of elfin mythological characters with powers that is related to the four elements. And you can see how Eugenia has interpreted the form of those elements as power symbols coming out of their hands. You can almost imagine this as the beginnings of a great epic manga comic. Now, technique-wise, look at the line work that Eugenia has used here. Very consistent throughout and variable. Very nice. Gurprem, these are really quite interesting. But I do want to comment on the fact that conceptually, it's like you've created two different concepts. The top two, earth and air, sort of feel similar in how they've taken familiar objects and interpreted them using these branching shapes. The two on the bottom, however, feel like they belong together as a separate set. What's interesting is that I think both concepts are really quite interesting. You could have gone with either one of them and created a conceptually consistent set. As it is now, though, it does feel kind of separated. Very nicely done. Jasmine has interpreted the elements as trees. Now, the only thing I'll say is that as a concept, it's not bad, but it is familiar. What I think you've done well here, Jasmine, is being consistent with your technique primarily, but you haven't been completely consistent. The one in the top left represents Earth, but is the only one of the set that doesn't have some sort of secondary graphic to suggest Earth is the element being represented. For the other three, you do. One thing that would have suggested ground is if you had put leaves from that tree on the ground as if they had fallen there. And then I think that would have been consistent. Nicely done, Jasmine. Jordan, this is really interesting. Jordan's interpreted the four elements as seen through a volcanic eruption. Water is represented by the ocean around the island. Earth is represented by the vegetation growing on that island, fire by the lava coming out of the top, and finally air, the smoke coming out after the eruption. Conceptually, this is really quite interesting. Technique-wise, it seems here that Jordan has worked from dark to light, meaning taking a dark background and painting white over top of that. This creates a very interesting and dynamic and graphic look. This is a very interesting set. Very nicely done, Jordan. Now, Julianne has interpreted the four elements as musicians playing their instruments. What I love about this is the surreal quality of each one of these, especially the water that's rising around our pianist as she plays. Look how Julianne has composed these with a close-up inset illustration behind each figure. That's wonderful visual storytelling, reminiscent of comics. These are beautiful, Julianne. Now, Kelsey's interpreted the four elements as natural disasters. You've been very consistent about using a house in each one of these as the thing that is being threatened. What I really love about these conceptually is how at least 3 out of the 4 of them are being destroyed in a rather unique and surreal way, with it either being blown away in a tornado, or how the trees have grown through the house, or how the wave is coming over top of it. The only one that doesn't quite have that is the fire one. Now, technique-wise, this is beautiful. I believe Kelsey is using some brush and ink washes, utilizing what is called a wet and wet technique, especially in the trees. This is something we'll talk about a little bit later. Look at the wet and to wet technique in the smoke and the fire. Kelsey, these are absolutely stunning. Way to go. Kai Lin has interpreted our 4 elements as fantastical characters. And these are beautiful. Look at all that lovely detail drawing, especially in the foliage and the planets. The only thing I'll say is that I do want you to be careful about your line quality and your line weight. Now, of the 4, I think 3 are absolute knockouts. However, I would have loved to have seen a little bit more variety in the shapes of the fire. Otherwise, these are absolutely fabulous. Now, Manjot has interpreted the 4 elements as different emotions, showing a different person expressing that emotion. As a concept, this is very clear and straightforward. My only issue with this is in terms of technique. Each of the 4 feels like it was done in a slightly different style. Each one feels good on its own, but as a set, they don't quite match. Nicely done, Manjot. Michaela has done something really interesting here, interpreting the 4 elements in terms of interpersonal relations. We see fire expressed as anger in the top left with the clenched fist. Air is represented by the space between them as each seek their own space. And then water represented by the 2 people floating apart from each other as they contemplate their lives of separateness. And finally, earth represented by the coming together of the 2 people in an embrace that suggests Mother Earth. Michaela, this is beautiful storytelling. I absolutely love this. Technique-wise, we see here an influence that suggests a familiarity with indie comics. Conceptually, technique-wise, I think this is an absolute knockout. Way to go. Now, Muhammad has interpreted the 4 elements as a vehicle moving through different environments. We have earth at the top left, then water as it drives through the rain, air as it drives by a factory with belching smokestacks, and finally fire as it drives through a forest fire. This is an interesting concept. It's almost like a story. My only issue is with some of the technique. It does seem like the line work could have been simplified. Now, this is where refining your drawing is really helpful. This drawing is more like a preliminary sketch. What I would have loved to have seen you do is take some tracing paper and put it over top of this and redraw it. Otherwise, this is a really interesting idea. Way to go, Muhammad. Now, Rebecca has interpreted our 4 elements as a fish moving through its life. In the top left, we see the fish in its natural environment, very happy, living in the ocean. Next to that, we see the fish caught and brought to dry land, to earth, where he naturally expires. We see his poor fishy soul flying off to heaven through the air, but in terms of the fish's real body, becomes the meal over the frying pan and the fire. Rebecca, this is a wonderful story, but I particularly love the technique that you've used, incorporating graphic patterns throughout. Even though the graphic patterns are different in each of the 4, because of the way you've used them and the line work associated with those patterns, it feels like a very consistent set. Way to go. Now, Stephen has interpreted our 4 elements, I believe, as a forest fire. We see the flames as it destroys a tree on the bottom right. On the left, we see the stump of that poor tree being blown in the wind. Above that, we see that stump being washed away by the rain and water. And then finally, the stump grows back into the earth to regenerate the forest floor. At least that's how I'm reading it, Steve. You probably have a different interpretation. But either way, I think this is a really interesting concept. Technique-wise, there is some really interesting stuff going on here, although there is a little bit of inconsistency with how some of the line work and some of the shading has been handled. Mostly in terms of the fire one at the bottom. But it is very dramatic. I think you've done some really nice work here, Stephen. Way to go. Now, Tyler has interpreted these 4 elements as tribal masks. These are a lot of fun. I love how Tyler has been able to reflect the graphic elements in these masks in so many different ways. But technique-wise, there is some really wonderful stuff going on with how Tyler has handled the line. That line variability is really interesting. The thicker contour lines around the edges of our shapes really do help to unify them, but then using lighter weight interior lines to describe some of the textures and shapes in those masks balances those heavier lines. Way to go, Tyler. Now, Sandeep has done something really interesting here. She's combined the 4 elements into these 2 surreal illustrations. These are quite interesting, but they do suffer a little bit from some conceptual uncertainty. But I do find these images very appealing. The only thing I'll mention as far as technique goes is that I often suggest that people not use graphite pencil when executing this black and white project. The reason being is that graphite is a reflective material, making it kind of hard to take good photos. Nicely done, Sandeep. Now, Megan has done something really interesting. She's interpreted the 4 elements in a very graphic way. What I love about these is the design. Megan's been very careful about balancing her black and white shapes together. What's interesting is that each one of these 4 elements is basically a white shape that has been drawn against a black background. You could almost imagine all 4 of these lined up horizontally as consisting of a white stripe that goes through all 4 of them. That would be an interesting way to display this. I think this is an absolute knockout. Way to go. Now, Aiden has interpreted the 4 elements in a set of illustrations that collectively he's called the Commute. So I'm assuming this is someone heading off to work. You've been very consistent with how you've handled your character. I think these are really interesting. My only issue is that 3 of the 4 show some sort of context, either being on a street or in a canoe or out in the mountains. But our guy who's running with the fire exists in a contextless void. But I think you could fix this really quickly. Let's imagine what kind of background he could be running in. If he's running so fast that there is fire coming off of him, perhaps he's running a race. Maybe there's a finish line that he's crossing. That would bring a context into this one illustration, and thereby helping to unify the set. Just a suggestion. Nicely done. Now, Chandandeep has interpreted the 4 elements as various Winnie the Pooh drawings. This is a lot of fun, although, of course, we have to be careful about proprietary characters. Of course, it's fun to draw existing characters, but I will encourage you to come up with your own characters. Chandandeep, I think you could have perhaps used Winnie the Pooh as an inspiration and then come up with your own character and put that character into these situations. Now, in terms of technique, I will encourage you to be a little bit more careful about how you handle your lines. Nicely done. Now, Jade, what an absolute wonderful set. Again, we see a fish moving through its life in a slightly different way, though. What I really want to commend, though, is the technique. Jade has used a variety of pen and ink techniques, from stipple to hatching. I particularly love the composition of the top left and rhythm of that underwater seaweed. These are beautiful. Way to go, Jade. Mayhak Deep has interpreted our 4 elements as different heart shapes, and you can almost imagine the emotions that are associated with each one. Air, it looks like falling in love. Fire is the red-hot passions. The water pouring out of the heart suggests heartbreak. And then finally, earth at the bottom suggests someone who is serene and at peace. My only issue is, again, a matter of technique. Again, I suggest refining your drawing before you go to the final execution. Finally, Rio has interpreted our 4 elements as 4 different characters. These are wonderfully seen. Rio has a flair for facial expressions. Conceptually, this is interesting, but what I really love about these is the technique, especially the line weight and variability. Look at the variety of line weights that have been used in the hair. It really does feel unified because of that. I also really like how you've handled the graphic shapes in the background, using lighter values so that they don't compete with the foreground figures. These are a lot of fun. Way to go, Rio. And way to go, everybody. These are all really very impressive.